If I asked you to name the biggest, most vital hubs of the American slave trade, you would probably immediately picture the Deep South.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like you'd picture the harbor in Charleston, South Carolina, or maybe the auction blocks in New Orleans.
Right, which makes sense.
And you would
Yeah.
be right. Those were massive centers of human trafficking. But what if I told you that if we look at the historical data, one of the most important engines organizing and funding this horrific commerce was operating out of a completely different region?
Mhm.
What if I told you one of the top 5 ports was Newport, Rhode Island?
It's just a profound shock to our collective memory, isn't it?
It really is.
We have this incredibly persistent, sanitized myth in the United States that slavery was an exclusively Southern phenomenon, like just an isolated regional sin.
Yeah, exactly. Like the North had nothing to do with it.
Right. But when you dive into the customs manifests, the shipping logs, the financial records, that geographic binary completely falls apart.
It totally shatters.
It does. The reality is far more entangled and deeply national.
And that is exactly what we are here to do today. Welcome to another deep dive. I'm so glad you're joining us because today's mission is, well, it's a big one.
A very big one.
We are unpacking an incredibly dense, pivotal collection of historical research that traces the entire trajectory of slavery in the United States.
Yeah.
We're going to walk from its very earliest colonial foundations right up to the explosive political crisis at the very end of 1860 and the earliest dawn of 1861.
And I think it's crucial to state right up front that what we are looking at today isn't just a simple timeline of dates and battles.
No, definitely not.
This isn't the sanitized summary you might remember from a high school textbook.
Right. It's so much more than that.
It is a comprehensive, microscopic look at the economic, the political, the societal, and the cultural machinery of a system that completely defined the nation.
Yeah.
Our goal today is to give you a thorough understanding of how slavery was built, how it expanded, and ultimately why it shattered the Union. We want to really look under the hood of this engine.
Okay, let's unpack this because the story the historical record tells is so much more intricate and honestly so much more chilling than those basic dates.
Absolutely.
So let's start with the problem of the beginning. The date everyone knows, the one that gets all the focus, is 1619.
Right. 1619. It is an undeniably pivotal year. It matters immensely because that is the year captive Africans were brought to English Virginia, landing at Point Comfort.
Yeah.
And Virginia became absolutely central to the development of slavery in the English mainland colonies. So it is a foundational moment.
Right.
But if we ask the strictly historical question, like, did human bondage exist in North America before 1619? The answer is a definitive yes.
Wait, hold on. If 1619 isn't the absolute starting line for slavery in North America, what was happening before that? I mean,
Right.
I think a lot of us just assume the English invented the concept on this continent.
That is a very common misconception.
Yeah.
Yeah. The Spanish imperial systems of forced labor targeting indigenous populations and eventually imported African captives, they were already operating in parts of what is now the United States long before that English ship arrived in Virginia.
Oh, wow.
The Spanish had established St. Augustine in Florida decades earlier, and human bondage was part of their colonial apparatus.
Okay. That completely shifts the timeline.
It does. But even within English America, the historical consensus stresses that 1619 does not mark the finished arrival of a fully developed racialized caste order.
Right. It wasn't just...
It wasn't a prepackaged system that they just unloaded off a boat ready to go.
It was an early point in a much, much longer construction. The historical texts use a specific phrasing that really caught my attention.
How was that?
It said, what became the United States did not inherit slavery passively.
Yes.
It wasn't just this old world stain that drifted ashore on the tide and everyone just sighed and accepted it. Colonial lawmakers, merchants, and landowners actively, deliberately built it.
What's fascinating here is that distinction completely changes the moral picture of this history.
Exactly.
Slavery wasn't simply there, like a mountain or a river. It was made useful, then it was made lawful, and then it was made normal.
Yeah.
Over the 17th century, English mainland colonies increasingly hardened what was initially African-descended servitude into something entirely different. They forged it into hereditary, racialized chattel slavery.
Let's talk about exactly how they did that. Because they didn't just wake up one day and declare it so. They did it through the law.
brick by brick.
Right, brick by brick. They passed specific statutes to engineer this reality.
Exactly. The mechanism was the colonial legislature.
Yeah.
For example, they passed laws governing maternal status.
Yeah.
In 1662, Virginia passed a law stating that the status of a child followed the status of the mother. It's a concept known in legal terms as partus sequitur ventrum.
Which completely flipped traditional English common law on its head, right? Because under English common law, a child inherited the status of the father.
You hit the nail on the head. They deliberately altered centuries of English legal tradition for one very dark economic purpose.
To ensure that children were born into slavery.
Yes, to ensure that the children of enslaved women, often fathered by white enslavers, would be born into slavery in perpetuity.
That is so dark.
It turned enslaved women's bodies into literal engines for reproducing the labor force. That is a conscious, engineered legal choice.
And it didn't stop there. They passed laws regarding manumission, the process by which an owner could legally free an enslaved person.
Right.
But wait, why would the colonies want to restrict an owner's right to free someone? If slavery is supposed to be about private property, shouldn't you be able to do what you want with your property?
It's a great question, and it gets to the heart of how slavery functioned as social control.
How so?
As the enslaved population grew, the colonial elites became terrified of a large, free, black population.
All right.
If you have thousands of free black people walking around, living independently, it completely undermines the psychological control of the enslaved and destroys the racial binary.
Because the whole system relied on the idea that blackness equaled servitude.
Precisely. The entire system relied on the lie that blackness equated to inherent servitude. A free black population proved that lie wrong every single day.
So they made it basically impossible to free them.
Yeah, they made manumission incredibly difficult, legally cumbersome, and financially ruinous for the owner to attempt.
They also tackled religion. I remember reading about early laws ensuring that baptizing an enslaved person did not grant them physical freedom.
Yes.
Because initially there was this idea that a Christian couldn't hold a fellow Christian in bondage, right?
That was a theological debate, yeah. Early on, some enslaved people used baptism as a legal argument for freedom.
And how did the lawmakers react?
The colonial assemblies panicked. They immediately passed laws stating that spiritual equality does not equal earthly equality.
Wow, just shut it down completely.
They did. They restricted movement. They codified brutal punishments, branding, whipping, dismemberment, without any legal recourse for the victim.
You know, it's like we often think of slavery as a terrible weather system that just blew in and settled over the colonies, like a hurricane that nobody could stop.
Right, as if it was inevitable.
But the historical record shows it was actually a skyscraper. It was built brick by brick, law by law, with a very deliberate, calculated architectural plan.
That's a really good way to put it.
Which brings up the obvious question, why? Why go through the immense legal and societal effort to build this horrifying skyscraper?
At the most foundational level, the answer is straightforward. It was the demand for labor.
Economics.
Yeah, economics.
Yeah.
The colonial economy, especially the export agriculture sector, demanded an enormous, highly disciplined labor force.
Right.
If you look at British North America, land was incredibly abundant by European standards. You could claim hundreds, thousands of acres.
But land doesn't do anything on its own.
Exactly. Land without labor is just wilderness.
Mhm.
It generates no wealth. And labor to work that land was scarce, and it was expensive.
Because people wanted their own land.
Right. Free colonists wanted their own farms. They didn't want to break their backs clearing someone else's land for meager wages.
So you had all this land waiting to be turned into profit, tobacco in the Chesapeake region, rice and indigo down in the Carolina Low Country.
Mm-hmm.
All of these crops promised massive wealth in the European markets, but only if someone could solve that fundamental labor bottleneck.
And slavery solved it.
Yeah.
It solved in the most brutal, dehumanizing way imaginable by legally converting human beings into inheritable property and permanent labor claims.
Right.
But, and this is where the historical data pushes us to look deeper, labor scarcity alone does not explain the full shape of the system.
What do you mean?
Well, plenty of societies throughout human history have wanted cheap labor, and they've used serfdom or indentured servitude or peasant labor without developing this specific, all-encompassing racial caste system.
Right, that's a fair point. So what made the British mainland colonies so distinctive? Why did they push it to this absolute racialized extreme?
It was the way that labor demand fused with racial ideology and settler politics.
Okay.
Racial slavery did heavy economic work, obviously,
Yeah.
but the archives point out that it also did vital political work.
Political work. How?
It tied poor and middling white colonists to a racial hierarchy where they were automatically legally positioned above black people.
Let's explore the mechanics of that, because in the early days, you had poor white indentured servants and poor enslaved black people working side by side, right?
Yeah.
Suffering under the same wealthy planters.
Yes,
They
exactly.
had a lot in common, class-wise.
They had everything in common. And in colonies that were highly prone to labor unrest and social instability, that commonality was terrifying to the elite.
Ah, so if they teamed up.
Right. If poor whites and poor blacks realized they outnumbered the wealthy planters and decided to ally against them, the elite rule would collapse overnight.
So slavery was the wedge.
Slavery and the specific racial laws we just discussed helped stabilize that elite rule. It created a permanent, visible underclass based on skin color.
Wow.
It gave poor whites a psychological and social stake in the system, a sense of superiority and belonging, even if they didn't own a single enslaved person themselves.
So it wasn't just an economic shortcut, it was a profound mechanism of social control.
Yes.
It was a way for the very wealthy to maintain their grip on a volatile frontier society by turning the poorer classes against each other.
That's exactly it.
How does shifting our view from a natural occurrence to this constructed legal order change how we understand the later defense of the system?
Oh, it changes everything. Because once you understand that it was constructed, you realize that by the 18th century, slavery was no longer merely a labor arrangement.
She was bigger than that.
It had become a social constitution. It structured absolutely everything in the American South.
Like what?
It structured property, family, status, religion, and political power. It was a governing order. It shaped who could testify in court, who could marry legally, who could freely move about town, and who counted as a member of the political community.
It was the water they were swimming in. It was in the courts, the state assemblies, the churches, the customs houses.
Everywhere.
It adapted to plantation districts and port cities alike. It was in frontier settlements and high-end financial markets.
And if you begin with that understanding that this was a deliberately built, highly adaptable governing order, the road to 1860 makes so much more sense.
Right.
The crisis that leads to the Civil War isn't the story of some antiquated old system just naturally fading away and accidentally provoking a conflict because people stubbornly clung to the past.
It wasn't fading at all.
Not at all. It's the story of a dynamic system that was built on purpose, enriched dramatically, expanded territorially, defended with fierce ideology, and then ultimately forced into a crisis when the country could no longer agree on its future expansion.
It was a machine. And if slavery was this deliberately constructed massive machine, it required an equally massive supply chain to populate it and keep it running.
It did.
Which leads us directly into where these millions of enslaved people were brought from and exactly how the logistics of this human trafficking functioned.
It's very common in casual conversation to say that enslaved people in America came from Africa.
Right. You hear that all the time.
And yes, in the broadest geographical sense, that is true. But historically, that is nowhere near enough detail.
No.
Africa is a massive, incredibly diverse continent. It is not a single point of origin, and treating it as one erases the immense complexity of the people who were stolen from it.
Right. It's like saying someone came from Eurasia. It doesn't tell you anything about their language, their specific agricultural skills, their religion, or their culture.
Exactly.
The historical databases list the major regions of origin for the British mainland colonies as West Central Africa, the Bight of Biafra, the Bight of Benin, the Gold Coast, and Senegambia.
The Transatlantic Slave Trade Database has illuminated this beautifully. The traffic was continental in scale, and it was highly varied regionally over time.
It wasn't just a simple funnel.
No, it was not just a single-channel funnel pouring an undifferentiated mass of people across the ocean. And those regional distinctions mattered immensely on the ground in the Americas.
Because these people didn't arrive as blank slates. They weren't empty vessels.
Exactly. They carried their cultures across the Middle Passage.
Yeah.
Even through the catastrophic, unimaginable dislocation of capture, the march to the coast, the holding pens, and the horrific ocean crossing, they brought language patterns.
They survived with their knowledge.
They brought deep agricultural knowledge. They brought religious traditions, foodways, and forms of social memory.
I want to look at a really specific example of this because I think it helps ground the history. Let's talk about the Low Country Rice Complex in South Carolina and Georgia.
Oh, that's a perfect example.
Modern public history institutions in those coastal regions today actively stress the connection between the rice-growing regions of West Africa and the enslaved labor force that built the Carolina Lowcountry. How exactly did that connection work?
It's a profound transfer of knowledge. English colonists didn't know how to grow rice.
Right, it wasn't a British crop?
It wasn't a crop they cultivated in Great Britain.
Yeah.
But many of the captives brought from regions like Senegambia and the Windward Coast came from societies that had cultivated rice for generations.
They were experts.
They understood the complex tidal irrigation required. They understood how to construct the dikes and the trunks to control the water flow. They knew how to process the grain.
Wow.
The planters in South Carolina explicitly sought out captives from these regions because they needed that intellectual property, essentially. They needed the agricultural engineering knowledge of the people they were enslaving.
So the immense wealth of Charleston wasn't just built on stolen physical labor, it was built on stolen intellectual expertise.
Now, historians are careful to point out that this doesn't mean colonial planters operated with perfect ethnographic knowledge, like they were putting in precise, customized orders for specific tribes on Amazon.
Right, it wasn't that neat.
The trade was chaotic, opportunistic, and brutal. But it does mean that the Atlantic system frequently links specific African regions to specific American labor regimes.
Yeah.
The cultural and agricultural effects were durable. They survived the crossing and took root in the American soil.
But there's another logistical layer to this supply chain that the shipping logs highlight, which I think a lot of Americans completely miss.
What's that?
A huge share of the people who lived enslaved in what became the U.S. did not arrive directly from Africa to a mainland port like Charleston or Savannah.
No, they did not.
Yeah.
The British Atlantic world was a highly integrated, complex economic system.
Right.
Many captives were landed first in the Caribbean, in places like Jamaica or Barbados.
Okay.
They were sold there, put to work on the sugar plantations, sometimes subjected to what the enslavers chillingly called seasoning.
Seasoning? That sounds awful.
It was a horrific, violent process of attempting to break them psychologically and physically into the brutal labor system while exposing them to new diseases. And then later, many were re-exported and brought into mainland North America. The mainland colonies were completely tied into this larger imperial web of shipping, insurance, finance, and human redistribution.
So you have this massive layered logistical network spanning oceans and islands, and the endpoints of that network on the mainland were the ports.
Yes.
Let's dig into those ports, because the geography of the coast dictated the horrific bureaucracy of the trade.
When we rank the ports of entry, historians caution us that it depends slightly on what exactly you're accounting: direct arrivals from Africa, or coastal redistribution from the Caribbean, or the organization and financing of the voyages themselves.
Right.
But there is one undisputed heavyweight on the list. The clearest point, not debated at all. Charleston, South Carolina, was the largest transatlantic slave trade port of entry in mainland North America.
The numbers are staggering. The public history work built from the major databases states that nearly 150,000 kidnapped Africans arrived through Charleston Harbor.
It's massive.
That is more than 40% of all those brought to North America. Charleston's centrality is a defining, undeniable fact of American slavery.
Yes.
And when you visit Charleston today and look at the beautiful historic architecture, you are looking at wealth generated directly from that harbor.
What's fascinating here is, well, when you look closely at these ports, you see the true cold modernity of the institution.
Modernity.
Ports were where extreme human violence met mundane everyday paperwork.
Right.
There were places where the horror of capture in Africa was legally transformed into normal, taxable commerce in the Americas.
Explain the mechanism of that transformation. How does a kidnapped person legally become a commodity?
It happens through bureaucracy. When a slave ship arrived in Charleston, it had to clear customs.
Just like any cargo ship today.
Exactly. The ship's captain had to present manifests. They had to pay import duties to the local government. The captives were then moved to warehouses or directly to auction blocks.
Wow.
The sales were heavily advertised in local newspapers, sitting right next to ads for furniture or tea.
That is so deeply unsettling.
The purchases were backed by credit instruments, loans from local banks, and insurance policies. The state sanctioned every single step of it, providing the courts to enforce the contracts and the police to ensure security.
It wasn't wild, chaotic piracy. It wasn't operating in the shadows. It was highly organized, heavily regulated, bureaucratic commerce.
Precisely. It was commerce in its most cold-blooded, legally protected form.
Yeah.
After Charleston, the list of top ports gets a bit more complex, but the data gives us a very defensible top 5.
Okay, let's hear them.
We have Charleston at number 1. Then we have Savannah, Georgia, which was a massive entry point for West Africans destined for the low-country rice and later the short staple cotton fields.
Right.
We had New Orleans, which started as a site of Atlantic importation under French and Spanish rule and later became the ultimate terrifying hub of the domestic trade.
Yep.
We have the Virginia-Hampton Roads complex, which was central early on for tobacco and later became the massive exporter to the South.
But wait, I want to stop right there on the final port in that top 5, because this is the hook we started with. You just listed 4 deeply southern ports, but there's a northern port in the top 5.
Yes, Newport, Rhode Island.
Here's where it gets really interesting for you listening. We always picture southern plantations with Spanish moss, but seeing a northern hub like Newport, Rhode Island right there on the top 5 list of major slave ports completely shifts the paradigm.
It really does.
It completely forces us to reevaluate the North's hands in this.
It completely shatters the myth of an innocent North.
Oh, no.
Now, to be precise, Newport wasn't the largest receiving port for a local enslaved population to work on local Rhode Island plantations.
Okay, so what was it doing?
Its paramount importance was as a great northern hub for organizing and financing the trade. Northern ports were deeply, intimately entangled in the business of slavery. They were the masters of what we call the commercial triangle.
Let's break down that triangle. How did it function like a modern supply chain?
Think of it like a modern multinational corporation where different continents handle different stages of production.
Okay.
In New England, particularly Rhode Island and Massachusetts, they had massive distilleries. They would take New England rum, load it onto ships built in northern shipyards, financed by northern banks, and insured by northern companies.
Right.
They would sail that rum to the coast of West Africa. There, they traded the rum for human captives.
Wow.
They then transported those captives across the Middle Passage to the Caribbean or the American South, sold them, and used the profits to buy molasses. They brought that molasses back to New England to distill into more rum, starting the cycle all over again.
It's like someone today claiming their hands are perfectly clean because they don't personally operate a sweatshop, even while their entire investment portfolio, their shipping company, and their banking sector rely entirely on the profits generated by that sweatshop.
That is a perfect analogy. The wealth of the North, the capital that eventually helped fuel the Northern Industrial Revolution, was heavily subsidized by the Atlantic slave trade.
The whole country was in on it.
The entire national economy was implicated. But a massive tectonic shift occurred at the turn of the 19th century.
What happened?
The system transformed from an import business into a domestic self-sustaining engine.
Let's get into that shift, because it fundamentally changed the nightmare. On January 1st, 1808, the United States officially ended the legal transatlantic slave trade.
Yes.
No more legally importing captive people from Africa or the Caribbean into the U.S. Now, if you were just looking at a timeline, you might assume that ending the international slave trade in 1808 was a step toward ending slavery altogether.
That's what people think, yeah.
Like the founders were slowly choking it out, putting it on a path to extinction. But when you look at the economics, it actually made the internal system more valuable and, frankly, more horrific, didn't it?
It absolutely did. And to understand why, we have to look at a fundamental math problem in the demographics.
Okay.
In 1790, there were roughly 700,000 enslaved people in the United States. By 1860, that number had exploded to 3.95 million.
Wait, hold on. If the international slave trade was banned in 1808, how on earth did the enslaved population quadruple by 1860? That math doesn't make sense to me unless something incredibly dark is happening internally.
Your instinct is exactly right. By 1860, the vast majority of those 3.95 million enslaved people were American-born. They were no longer recent arrivals from Africa. They were people whose parents, grandparents, and often great-grandparents had lived and died in American bondage.
It was a captive population.
The U.S. wasn't just participating in an international system anymore. It had become extraordinarily proficient at breeding, reproducing, and managing a captive population on its own soil.
The historians point out a reality here that I find incredibly powerful. They argue that this fact that the population was almost entirely American-born deepens rather than lessens the horror.
I agree.
It wasn't a foreign imposition anymore. It was an entirely domestic product.
The nation had industrialized human reproduction. And the catalyst for this massive domestic explosion was cotton, specifically the rise of short staple cotton in the 1790s.
Okay, let's explain the botany and the mechanics here, because short staple cotton sounds like a minor agricultural footnote, but it actually changed the course of world history. What is the difference between long staple and short staple cotton?
It's all about geography and the sticky seeds. Long staple cotton was highly profitable, but it was fragile.
Okay.
It could only be grown in very specific, specialized environments, mostly along the immediate coast and the sea islands of Georgia and South Carolina. It had smooth seeds that were relatively easy to remove by hand.
So it was easy to process.
Right. Short staple cotton, on the other hand, was incredibly hardy. It could grow almost anywhere inland across the massive expanse of the American South.
So why weren't they growing it everywhere?
The problem was that its seeds were intensely sticky and tangled in the fibers. It took an enslaved person an entire day to clean just 1 pound of short staple cotton by hand.
1 pound a day.
Yes, it was a massive bottleneck that made it economically unviable.
Until the cotton gin?
Until the cotton gin. Eli Whitney's invention in the 1790s mechanized the removal of those sticky seeds.
And that changed everything.
Suddenly, a single worker using a gin could clean 50 pounds of cotton a day instead of 1. The bottleneck was shattered. Suddenly, the entire vast interior of the South, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, was incredibly viable for cotton production.
Fortunes were waiting to be made. It was a green gold rush.
Absolutely.
But they needed labor to clear that virgin land, plant the crops, and pick that endless sea of cotton. And since they couldn't legally import people from Africa after 1808, they had to get them from inside the country.
This is where the domestic slave trade explodes. And it is one of the darkest chapters in American history.
Yeah.
The states of the Upper South, places like Virginia and Maryland, had a problem. Their soil was somewhat depleted from generations of intensive tobacco farming. They had a surplus of enslaved labor relative to their agricultural needs.
Right.
But down in the Deep South, the demand for labor to grow cotton was infinite.
So the Upper South found a new, incredibly lucrative export: human beings.
Yes. Virginia essentially became a massive breeding ground and exporter of people. The domestic slave trade functions as a massive forced migration.
How many people are we talking about?
Over 1 million enslaved people were forcibly moved from the Upper South to the Deep South between 1790 and 1860.
How did they physically move 1 million people?
Through 2 primary methods. The first was coastwise shipping. Ships would load human cargo in the Hampton Roads complex in Virginia or in Baltimore and sail down the coast, around Florida, and into the Gulf of Mexico.
And they landed in New Orleans.
Landing in New Orleans, exactly, which emerged as the premier market hub for this internal trade. The National Archives are full of the coastal manifests of this traffic. Again, bureaucracy masking horror.
And the second method?
The overland coffles.
Coffles.
Yes, long lines of men, women, and children, chained together at the neck or the wrists, forced to walk hundreds of miles over weeks and months, from Virginia down into the brutal new frontiers of Mississippi and Louisiana. They were marched like livestock.
And this sprawling, highly visible domestic trade completely obliterates one of the most persistent, insidious myths about American slavery: the myth of paternalism.
The idea that the master was a kind, fatherly figure looking out for his people, providing for them in exchange for their labor.
Right, that myth.
The historical reality tears this down completely. The domestic trade reveals the lie of paternalism with absolute, undeniable clarity. Because no paternal protective order can possibly be squared with the routine, systemic sale of children away from their mothers and husbands away from their wives.
An enslaver in debt, or an enslaver who just wanted to buy more land, could literally turn a family into liquid capital.
Absolutely.
The sale yard was always waiting in the background. It wasn't a rare anomaly or an accident. It was the foundation of the economy. The constant threat of sale was the ultimate mechanism of psychological control.
And that control was exercised daily on the plantations. The archival accounts describe the plantation as both a workplace and a penal regime.
Yeah.
It organized land, time, punishment, and social rank. And there were different mechanisms of extracting that labor. You had the gang system and you had the task system.
Let's break those down. How did the gang system function on a cotton plantation?
The gang system, which was dominant in cotton and tobacco, was exactly what it sounds like. Laborers worked in large groups, pacing each other, under the constant, close supervision of a white overseer or an enslaved driver.
Constant supervision.
Yes. The overseer dictated the pace of work, usually from sunup to sundown, and if anyone fell behind the pace, the whip was used immediately. It was a system of continuous, synchronized, violently enforced motion.
And how is the task system different in the rice fields of South Carolina?
In the task system, enslaved people were assigned a specific daily quota, say, a quarter acre of rice field to hoe and weed. Once the task was completed to the overseer's satisfaction, their time for the rest of the day was supposedly their own.
Wait, so if a slave in South Carolina finished their quota early, were they free for the day? How did the enslaver benefit from that? It seems almost contrary to the idea of total exploitation.
That is exactly the insidious nature of the task system. It wasn't about granting freedom, it was about maximizing efficiency in a deadly environment.
Deadly environment.
The rice swamps were incredibly dangerous. Malaria, yellow fever, snakes, brutal heat. White overseers didn't want to stand out in the swamps all day.
I see.
The task system incentivized the enslaved to work at a breakneck pace to finish early. And what did they do with their free time? They grew their own food in small provision gardens, raised chickens, or fished.
So they were feeding themselves.
Exactly. This actually subsidized the planters' costs because the enslaved people were essentially feeding themselves off the clock. And if the planter felt the tasks were being finished too quickly, they would simply increase the quota the next day.
It's a psychological manipulation layered on top of physical exhaustion.
Yes.
Neither system meant autonomy. Both were simply different methods of extracting maximum labor and wealth from unfree people through the constant threat of violence. It was an absolute regime of heavy surveillance.
Slave patrols on the roads, strict fugitive laws, constant policing of movement.
Because they knew. The enslavers knew that if they relaxed that violent grip for a single second, the entire system would fracture. Because the enslaved people were never simply property in their own minds. They were thinking, loving, resisting human beings.
Which is the massive, unresolvable contradiction at the heart of the whole system. You were trying to treat a human being like a mule or a plow. But a plow doesn't remember or love or plan an escape or sabotage the equipment.
Exactly. The enslaved constantly resisted. They built families despite the immense legal fragility and the threat of the auction block.
Yes.
They created deep, vibrant religious worlds where they interpreted Christianity not as a religion of obedience, but as a religion of eventual deliverance. They pursued literacy in secret, passing knowledge down. They negotiated the terms of their labor where they could. They slowed down the work pace when the overseer wasn't looking. They broke tools, and they imagined freedom. And historians give us a very stern warning here. We must be exceedingly careful not to romanticize this survival.
Right. We have to honor that incredible resilience, but we cannot use it to soften the reality of the crushing domination they lived under.
Exactly.
We can't say, oh, they have their own gardens and their own songs, so it wasn't that bad. The system was absolute terror.
The fact that white Southerners generated so much paternalist rhetoric, the fact that they tried so hard to convince themselves and the world that slavery was a positive good, shows how desperately they needed to hide from the reality of what they were doing.
It was a delusion.
As the historical commentary points out, a master who truly believed slavery was a kind, benevolent institution would not need armed slave patrols, whipping posts, federal fugitive laws, and the constant looming terror of the auction block to sustain it.
That's entirely correct.
So let's step back and look at what we've built here. We have this massive, deeply entrenched system generating unimaginable national wealth from cotton, completely dependent on an internal domestic slave trade, and held together by constant surveillance and violence.
Yeah.
And because it was generating so much wealth, it created an insatiable hunger for land. The system couldn't just survive in place. It had to grow.
It had to expand.
Yeah.
And this brings us to what historians term the future tense of slavery, which is the absolute key to understanding the political crisis that tore the country apart.
The future tense. I like that phrase.
Let's look at the demographics again. In 1790, roughly 700,000 enslaved people. By 1860, 3.95 million.
A massive increase. And crucially, a severe regional concentration.
Right. If we look back to the colonial era, slavery existed in all 13 colonies. New York, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, they all had slavery.
Yeah.
But after the Revolution, the North moved toward legal emancipation. It was an uneven, gradual process, but it was decisive. Meanwhile, the South doubled down, deepened, and wildly expanded the institution. By 1860, slavery was overwhelmingly concentrated in the South.
The Census Bureau data from 1860 is shocking when you see it laid out visually.
It is.
In states like South Carolina, Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, and Georgia, the proportion of the population that was enslaved was incredibly high. Mississippi actually had a slave majority.
A majority.
Over 50% of the human beings living in the state of Mississippi in 1860 were legally categorized as property. South Carolina was just behind them.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this demographic concentration completely changes the meaning of politics.
How so?
When a huge share of your total population is enslaved, slavery isn't just an economic sector like manufacturing or the tech industry today. It is the social order.
It's everything.
It dictates everything. It dictates policing. It dictates the militia culture. It dictates the law, the fears of the elite, the allocation of labor, the tax structure. The ruling class in these states presided over societies built entirely, structurally, around human bondage.
And within the South, the center of power and wealth was shifting. It was moving from the older upper South states like Virginia and Maryland down into the deep South, into the Cotton Kingdom of Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana.
Right.
The census notes a tenfold growth in slave populations in states like Alabama between 1820 and 1860. And again, this wasn't from imports. It was the domestic trade forcibly moving people west and south.
So you have a highly concentrated, incredibly wealthy, socially entrenched system that is constantly moving southwest.
Constantly moving.
And that motion, that desperate need for new fertile land for cotton and new geographic markets to absorb the people being sold in the domestic slave trade made expansion the central, non-negotiable political imperative for the South.
Think of the Southern slave economy like a shark. It had to keep moving forward into new waters, new territories to survive.
That's a good way to look at it.
If you put it in a tank, even a massive tank like the existing southern states, and you stop it from expanding, it drowns. It starves. The soil depletes, the enslaved population grows, and the economic engine collapses in on itself.
That is a very apt analogy.
Yeah.
The South was no longer defending a static, quiet institution. They were defending a dynamic, expanding continental order.
Yeah.
The primary political issue in Washington wasn't simply whether slavery already existed in Virginia or Georgia. It was whether slavery would be permitted to expand into the vast new Western territories as the United States pushed toward the Pacific.
And this is where we have to pause and talk about states' rights. Because if you grew up in America, you hear this phrase all the time. People confidently say, the Civil War wasn't about slavery, it was about states' rights.
Right.
But the historical record tackles this head-on and dismantles it.
It does. When you look at the actual political behavior of Southern leaders, states' rights is revealed not as a separate, pure, abstract constitutional principle that caused the conflict, but as a highly selective constitutional language that was used specifically to defend and expand slavery.
It was a tool in the toolbox.
Exactly. It was a tool they picked up when it was useful and dropped without hesitation when it wasn't.
Okay, give me an example.
Southern politicians fiercely invoked states' rights when they were resisting Northern anti-slavery pressure. They would loudly declare, the federal government has no right to tell a sovereign state what to do with its domestic institutions.
Sure.
But, and this is the crucial glaring contradiction, they were perfectly willing to demand massive, robust federal overreach when it benefited and protected slavery.
Right. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 is the perfect example of this mechanism in action.
It is.
Let's look at what that law actually did. Southern leaders demanded that the federal government aggressively step into northern states, explicitly override local northern personal liberty laws, and use federal marshals to hunt down and return escaped enslaved people.
Yeah.
That is the exact opposite of respecting states' rights. That is demanding a powerful, centralized federal police force to protect Southern property inside northern borders.
They also demanded federal protection of slavery in the Western territories, regardless of what the local settlers wanted. So the fog of states' rights clears very quickly when you look at their actual demands.
They just wanted whatever worked.
They wanted whatever constitutional mechanism would best protect and expand their slaveholding order. And expansion was the strategic future. Yeah. Because if they couldn't move into new territories, those territories would eventually be admitted as free states.
Which brings us to the political math. If the new states are free states, the South loses parity in the United States Senate. They lose their equal voting bloc. They lose influence in the Electoral College. They would become permanently trapped as a political minority inside a union that they feared was growing increasingly hostile to their entire way of life.
We don't have to guess about this fear. Mississippi's later secession declaration explicitly complains about this exact mathematical reality.
What did they say?
They complain that the North seeks to extinguish slavery by confining it within its present limits and denying the power of expansion. So the conflict was fundamentally about slavery's expansion, its constitutional security, and its continued existence. They were inextricably tied together.
Okay, so if you're listening to this, you probably remember learning about all these various compromises in the 1800s, the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850.
Yeah, they'll kind of blur together, right?
They can blur together into a boring list of congressional acts. But understanding this desperate, shark-like need for expansion turns every single one of those acts into a dramatic life-or-death struggle. Every single new piece of land acquired by the United States became a massive national emergency. Let's trace that road to ruin.
The crisis of 1860 didn't just fall out of the sky. It was the final snapping link in a very long, highly strained chain. It really begins to crack open in public with the Missouri Compromise of 1820.
Let's unpack the mechanics of that. Why was Missouri the flashpoint?
Missouri applied for statehood as a slave state. At the time, there was an exact balance in the Senate, 11 free states and 11 slave states.
Okay.
Admitting Missouri would tip the balance of power to the South. Northern politicians, many motivated by a desire to keep Western lands for free white labor rather than moral abolitionism, pushed back hard.
So it was an economic pushback?
Largely, yes. The debates were incredibly vicious. The compromise they finally reached was to admit Missouri as a slave state, but balance it by admitting Maine as a free state.
And they drew a line.
Yes, the famous 36-degree 30-minute parallel. They drew a line westward across the remaining Louisiana Purchase territory. Everything north of the line would be free. Everything south could be slave.
Just literally cutting the map in half.
It was an attempt to physically partition the future. Thomas Jefferson, observing this from his retirement, famously called it a fire bell in the night, recognizing that drawing a geographical line based on a moral and political divide would eventually destroy the Union.
He saw it coming.
He did. The lesson the country learned in 1820 was that every Western question was inherently, unavoidably, a slavery question.
Then we move forward a decade, and you have the nullification crisis in the 1830s. Now, a lot of high school textbooks focus on the tariff issue here, taxes on imported goods. But the underlying current is much darker.
The tariff was the proxy battle. In South Carolina, political leaders like John C. Calhoun developed a radical constitutional theory.
Which was?
That a single state could nullify a federal law it deemed unconstitutional and ultimately secede if forced. They used the tariff as the test case, but the reason they were so incredibly hypersensitive to federal power was because they were a slave society. They were terrified that if the federal government had the power to force a tariff down their throats today, it would eventually use that same power to abolish slavery tomorrow. Nullification previewed the exact legal logic of secession that would be deployed 30 years later.
Then, in the 1840s, the map blows wide open. You have the annexation of Texas, the Mexican-American War, and the massive acquisition of new Western territories, what is now California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico.
Yeah, a massive amount of land.
Suddenly, the debate over expansion isn't just about the plains. It's on a continental scale, stretching all the way to the Pacific Ocean.
And this introduces the Wilmot Proviso.
Yeah.
In 1846, a Northern congressman named David Wilmot introduced an amendment proposing that slavery be strictly banned in any territory won from Mexico.
Now, it's important to clarify the motivations here. David Wilmot wasn't some crusading racial egalitarian, right?
Not at all. Wilmot was quite explicitly racist. He wanted to ban slavery in the West to preserve those lands exclusively for free white farmers and laborers.
So they wouldn't have to compete.
Exactly. So they wouldn't have to compete economically with the mass slave labor of wealthy Southern planters. But regardless of his personal motives, the proviso electrified the nation.
Did it pass?
It never passed the Senate, but it functioned as an alarm bell. It showed the South that the North was increasingly united against the expansion of their system. The fight was now undeniably about the future architecture of the entire republic.
So the political leaders in Washington panic, and they try to patch the dam again with the Compromise of 1850. They admit California as a free state. They leave the other territories ambiguous. But as we discussed earlier, to placate the South, they include the horrific Fugitive Slave Act.
Right.
Which strategically completely backfired on the South in a cultural sense, didn't it?
It was a massive strategic miscalculation. The Fugitive Slave Act required Northern citizens to actively assist in the capture of escaped slaves, under penalty of fine or imprisonment.
That's crazy.
It removed the comfortable distance Northerners had enjoyed. Many Northerners who weren't radical abolitionists, who had previously been perfectly happy to ignore slavery as long as it stayed in the South, suddenly deeply resented being legally conscripted into the brutal work of slave catching in their own streets and towns.
It brought it right to their front door. It radicalized public opinion. The middle ground was rapidly eroding.
And then the final fatal blow to the compromises, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. This law completely destroys the old Missouri Compromise line that had held the country together for over 30 years. Driven by Stephen A. Douglas, a Northern Democrat who wanted to organize the territories to build a transcontinental railroad, the act repealed the 36-degree 30-middle line.
Just wiped it out.
Instead, it instituted popular sovereignty in Kansas and Nebraska. The idea was simple, but incredibly naive. Let the white settlers who move there vote on whether to allow slavery or not.
Which predictably led to literal armed warfare, bleeding Kansas.
Exactly. Pro-slavery settlers, many crossing the border from Missouri, known as border ruffians, and anti-slavery settlers funded by Northern abolitionists flooded into Kansas.
Just a total clash.
They set up rival governments and started shooting each other. It was a proxy war over the future of the territory. The political system had failed, and violence had taken over.
And out of this chaos, a new political entity is born, the Republican Party.
This is a crucial turning point. The old national party systems, the Whigs and the Democrats, begin to collapse under the weight of the slavery issue.
Yeah.
The Republican Party emerges in 1854 as a purely sectional party, rooted entirely in the North. Their primary unifying platform was clear: halt the expansion of slavery into the territories.
Stop the shark.
Stop the shark. They were not demanding immediate abolition in the existing southern states, but their absolute commitment to stopping its spread made them an existential threat to the southern elite.
Because, again, the shark must keep moving. To the south, stopping expansion was a slow, agonizing death sentence for their entire economic and social system. The tension is now at a boiling point. Then you hit 1857 and the Dred Scott decision.
The Supreme Court, led by Chief Justice Roger Taney, issues a sweeping, devastating ruling. They rule that Black Americans, free or enslaved, cannot be citizens of the United States.
Wow.
Furthermore, they rule that Congress has no constitutional power to bar slavery in any territory. This decision effectively legalizes the expansion of slavery everywhere in the West, and it convinces the North that a slave power conspiracy has completely captured the federal government.
And just 2 years later, in 1859, the violence spills over again. John Brown, a radical abolitionist who had fought in Bleeding, Kansas, leads an armed raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia.
Yes.
His goal is to arm enslaved people and start a massive violent uprising. He fails and is executed, but what is the psychological effect on the South?
It is the ultimate nightmare realized. John Brown's raid convinces the white South that Northern anti-slavery sentiment isn't just political rhetoric. It is an active, violent plot to incite bloody insurrection and murder them in their beds.
So they're terrified.
When some Northerners celebrate Brown as a martyr, the psychological break is complete. By the time we reach 1860, the middle ground is completely gone. Each side views the other not as a political rival to be negotiated with, but as an existential threat to their survival and their future.
Which brings us to the powder keg, the election of 1860. This wasn't a normal election with two parties debating tax policy. The historical data describes this as 4 regional contests crammed inside one fractured national constitution.
The Democratic Party, which was the last major political institution capable of spanning both the North and the South, had completely fractured over the issue of slavery in the territories. They literally split in half at their convention.
Okay, so who was running?
So you end up with a 4-way race. You have Abraham Lincoln for the Republicans. You have Stephen A. Douglas representing the Northern Democrats. You have John C. Breckinridge representing the Southern Democrats, running on a platform of federal protection for slavery everywhere. And you have John Bell for the Constitutional Union Party, essentially running on a platform of ignoring the issue and hoping it goes away.
Let's look closely at the math of Lincoln's victory, because it explains why the South panicked so profoundly, so immediately. Lincoln wins the presidency with 180 electoral votes. But when you look at the popular vote, he only received about 39.8% of the national total.
Less than 40% of the country voted for him.
And here's the absolute kicker. He won absolutely zero electoral votes from the slave states of the Deep South.
Yeah.
In fact, in many Deep South states, Abraham Lincoln wasn't even printed on the ballot. You couldn't vote for him if you wanted to. South Carolina didn't even hold a popular vote. Their state legislature just chose the electors.
Right.
Lincoln's entire winning coalition was rooted exclusively in the free states of the North and the West.
This is the deepest political meaning of the 1860 election. Lincoln didn't win because the whole nation suddenly woke up and became radical abolitionists. Much of his coalition was just anti-expansion. They wanted Western lands for free white labor. But from the perspective of the Southern slaveholding elite, the critical, terrifying fact was this. A president had just been elected by a coalition entirely outside the slave South, a coalition explicitly committed to blocking the expansion of slavery.
It proved to them that their worst nightmare had come true. They were now a permanent political minority. They had definitively lost control of the national government.
Exactly. Lincoln had given his famous Cooper Union address earlier that year, meticulously arguing that the federal government absolutely had the constitutional authority to restrict slavery in the territories.
And the South heard that loud and clear.
For the South, that meant the immense apparatus of the federal government would now be controlled by men actively putting slavery on the defensive.
Even though Lincoln wasn't promising to march an army down and free the enslaved people in Georgia tomorrow, the Southern leaders understood the mechanics of their own system. Confining slavery was dangerous to slavery.
Absolutely.
Without expansion, their political parity in the Senate dies forever. The economic opportunity of the West vanishes. The lucrative markets for the domestic slave trade dry up. The moral and political legitimacy of their system erodes. They saw the writing on the wall.
And they decided that the only way to save their slaveholding republic was to leave the Union, which brings us right to the edge of the cliff. The secession crisis.
So, what does this all mean? The documentary record is incredibly explicit here. When you read the actual documents produced by the seceding states, it raises a critical question for you listening.
Yes.
Why do you think so much modern debate still circles around states' rights or tariffs when the seceding states themselves practically shouted from the rooftops that they were leaving to protect and expand slavery?
The documentary record leaves absolutely no room for evasion. They did not hide their motives.
Not at all.
South Carolina's Declaration of Secession explicitly cited the election of a president whose opinions and purposes are hostile to slavery. Mississippi stated plainly, in the very second sentence of their declaration, our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world.
They just wrote it down.
Georgia framed its entire declaration around threats to slave property and the denial of expansion into the territories. They told us exactly why they were doing it.
So let's look at the chronology of how they actually pulled the trigger, because the timeline at the end of 1860 is vital, and it's often compressed in our historical memories into one sudden event.
It wasn't simultaneous. By the end of 1860, the entire South had not seceded. Only one state had.
Which is South Carolina.
South Carolina, which had been the radical vanguard since the nullification crisis, seceded on December 20, 1860. They issued their Declaration of Causes on December 24th. The rest of the Deep South states like Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, they didn't follow until January and early February of 1861.
So at the end of 1860, right at the new year, the situation was incredibly precarious. You have a lame duck president, James Buchanan, still sitting in the White House.
Yes, Buchanan.
He is notoriously weak and indecisive, essentially watching the country fall apart and arguing that secession is illegal, but that the federal government has no power to stop it. He does nothing.
He's paralyzed.
Meanwhile, you have federal forts in the South, most notably Fort Sumter, sitting in the middle of Charleston Harbor, acting as massive, looming questions of national sovereignty.
It's a tense standoff. If South Carolina claims they are now an independent, sovereign nation, and the federal government refuses to acknowledge that, who owns that fort? The tension is unbearable.
Right.
And crucially, the upper South states like Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas, they had not seceded yet in 1860. They were in a zone of agonizing uncertainty. They were deeply attached to the institution of slavery, but also deeply attached to the Union. They wouldn't get pushed over the edge until the war actually started, and Lincoln called for federal troops to suppress the rebellion.
So, at the stroke of midnight on December 31st, 1860, the United States is literally on a knife's edge. The narrative halts right here. The republic is fractured. The architecture of slavery has pushed the political system past its absolute breaking point, but the first shots haven't been fired yet. The war hasn't begun.
It's important to briefly note what happens immediately after the calendar turns to 1861, because you asked earlier about the birth of the Confederacy.
Right.
In early February 1861, delegates from the seceded Deep South states meet in Montgomery, Alabama. This is where they formally construct the Confederate States of America.
And they choose Jefferson Davis as their provisional president. And the records note, this wasn't a mass democratic election by the people of the South. This was an elite political selection by the planters.
Yes, Davis was a U.S. Senator from Mississippi, a wealthy planter, and a former Secretary of War. He had led the fierce, uncompromising defense of slavery in the Senate. He had the prestige, the military background, and the bearing the secessionist elite wanted to project stability. He was inaugurated in Montgomery in February.
But the capital didn't stay in Montgomery, Alabama. Everyone today thinks of Richmond, Virginia as the Confederate capital.
It only moved to Richmond later, in May 1861. And that happened because the Confederacy desperately needed Virginia. Once Virginia finally seceded in April, after the bombardment of Fort Sumter, the center of gravity immediately shifted.
Why Virginia specifically?
Virginia had the industrial capacity, the Tredegar Iron Works, the huge manpower reserves, and the massive symbolic prestige of the old colonial elite, the state of Washington and Jefferson. Moving the capital to Richmond bound the new Confederacy tightly to the wealth and power of the South's largest, oldest slave state.
And that detail strips away the historical simplification that the Confederacy just magically sprang into existence fully formed the moment Lincoln was elected. It was assembled rapidly, but in very deliberate, calculating stages, specifically to build a new national fortress around the institution of slavery. Decades of legal, cultural, and economic architecture had finally completely unspooled the nation.
It is a profound, tragic trajectory. A colonial labor regime that demanded hands for tobacco in the 1600s grew into a massive continent-spanning slave society.
Yeah.
The Atlantic trade fed it. The colonial laws hardened it into a racial caste. The cotton gin turbocharged it. And the domestic trade spread its horrors across the entire Deep South. It created a ruling class completely dependent, economically and psychologically, on treating human beings as collateral and capital. And because that system demanded constant expansion to survive, it eventually broke the constitutional framework of the United States.
Which completely changes how we view American history. It forces us to see that the system wasn't a tragic accident. It wasn't a weather sister. It was deliberate, engineered architecture. It took unbelievable amounts of law, bureaucracy, financial instruments, and cultural conditioning to sustain this system for centuries.
This raises an important question, though. The formal institution of slavery ended with the Civil War. But the ghosts of this deeply entrenched, continent-spanning economic engine and the complex racial ideologies constructed over centuries to justify it, they didn't just vanish into thin air when the fighting started or when the fighting stopped. The architecture left a long, enduring shadow over the country.
It really did, and it leaves me thinking. Think about the sheer amount of law, bureaucracy, and cultural conditioning it took to sustain this system for centuries. If a society can legally, economically, and culturally engineer a reality that horrific and normalize it so completely that half the country is willing to shatter the nation and go to war to protect it, well, what unexamined systems or contradictions are we normalizing in our own society today without even realizing it? What invisible architectures are we living inside right now, completely convinced that they are just the natural order of things? It's something to mull over. Thank you so much for joining us on this intense deep dive. We hope you walk away with a clearer, deeper understanding of how the machinery of history actually operates and why the past is never really past. Until next time, we crack open the records. Take care.